You were never meant to hear this. Somewhere in the cold silence of Appalachia, a girl was born with no name, because her family had run out of names. Her mother was also her cousin, her father, her uncle. She never left the cabin she was born in, not because she couldn't, but because the blood in her veins was already a prison. Welcome to the darkest branches of America's family tree, the ones nobody talks about. The ones sealed in handwritten Bibles, buried in basement trunks, locked in courthouse vaults. These women, forgotten, malformed, erased, weren't born into corruption. They were born from it. And what you're about to hear isn't just disturbing, it's forbidden. But before we descend, tell me in the comments, what country are you watching this from? And what time is it for you right now? Because this exact moment, it matters. You see, what we call inbreeding today is not an accident of isolated families. It was once a tool of control, a ritual of bloodline purity enforced by powerful lineages who believed their DNA was divine. The closer the blood, the closer to God, or so they were told. But in truth, it wasn't about divinity. It was about domination. Hidden inside the American landscape are names you've heard but never questioned. Families who shaped states, built banks, founded towns. And behind those names, generations of internal breeding so severe it rewired their children's minds, broke their bodies, and erased empathy from their blood. They called it tradition. We call it pathology. But they called it survival of the elite. And buried beneath the smiles in those faded black and white portraits is madness. Real madness. The kind that made daughters marry their fathers, that made brothers deliver their own nephews, the kind that created women with no voice, no freedom, and no idea they were trapped in a system centuries older than America itself. This is not just the story of a few remote families. This is a map of how power distorts nature, how isolation becomes ideology, and how entire bloodlines were sacrificed to maintain control. You ready to go deeper? Because what comes next is where the sickness really begins. They always start with silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that hums beneath the floorboards, that weighs on a room like a warning. That's the sound generations of women were born into, deep in the backwoods of Kentucky, West Virginia, Arkansas, and even more quietly, in wealthy towns you'd never suspect. You were told this was rare, that inbreeding is some freak accident of poor, forgotten people. But what if I told you that's a lie? The real story isn't about isolated hills. It's about controlled bloodlines, families who didn't just allow it, they engineered it. Let's start with the Whitakers. A family so inbred, their speech collapsed into animal-like groans, eyes pointing in different directions, limbs out of sync. But here's the part they won't say on camera. Those weren't the first, and they weren't the worst. The Whitakers are just a visible scar, a leftover. But across America, there are entire lineages hidden in plain sight, old money names that made deals with eugenics, manipulated marriage licenses, and built a system to recycle their own genes to keep the wealth and the blood inside. They called it pedigree. But it was rot, dressed in silk, sealed with a family crest. These women, America's most inbred daughters, didn't have a choice. Their wombs became battlegrounds for generational obsession. They were raised to obey, to reproduce, to keep the line unbroken. And when they broke down, mentally, physically, it wasn't seen as a tragedy. It was seen as the cost of legacy. No one talks about the neurological decay, the malformed spines, the stillbirths, the endless waves of schizophrenia and dementia, at age 12, at age 9. No one talks about the girls who went mute before puberty, who screamed at shadows, who couldn't walk without falling, whose minds splintered from birth. And when they disappeared, no autopsies, no press, just folded into the family crypt, a name never mentioned again. Because this isn't just history. It's a pattern, one that starts at the top, not the bottom. Inbreeding didn't survive because of ignorance. It survived because of power, and power doesn't let go of its secrets without a fight. Look closely at the portraits in your grandmother's attic, the ones no one dusts off. There's always something strange about them. Eyes too close together, jaws too sharp or too soft, expressions that don't quite match the faces. You think it's just the old photography. It's not. What you're seeing is degeneration, not of a person, of a bloodline. There's a reason these women were photographed so rarely. When they were usually seated, surrounded by others, faces half hidden behind lace, shadows, or angle. Because by then, even the families knew something was wrong. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. Their wealth, their control, their social status was fused to one belief: outsiders ruin the blood. So they married their own. Again. And again. And again. In one New England estate, buried in the family journals, we find record of a daughter, Annabelle, who was born to a father, 54, and a mother, 12, his niece. Annabelle died at 8, with an enlarged skull and eyes that never blinked. Her diary entries were scratched symbols, pages soaked in dried tears and red ink. She was buried under a fake name, because by then the family had rebranded. You'd recognize the surname today. It's on a bank you trust. But this isn't about shock. This is about how ritual becomes inheritance. See, inbreeding wasn't always shameful. In ancient dynasties, it was the divine right of kings. Pharaohs married sisters. European royals traded cousins like currency. In America, the elite carried that same torch, quietly. They built plantations, towns, and later, companies. Behind every empire, a closed circle. Behind every closed circle, women bred for continuity. And it worked. Until it didn't. Generations later, the cost came due. A girl born without a voice box, another with no pupils, one who aged backwards, not myths, medical records, covered, sealed, paid off. These women weren't just victims. They were sacrifices to a belief system deeper than law or morality, a system that believed power must never mix. So now I ask you, when you walk through an old American town and see a statue, a courthouse, a founder's name etched into stone, do you ever wonder what they buried with it? Because some of those stones hide more than dust. They didn't vanish. They evolved. The women born from America's most corrupted bloodlines didn't all die out in the hills or wither in basements. No. Some of them survived, and those who did were shaped into weapons. You see, when you raise a child inside a closed loop, genetically, psychologically, spiritually, you don't just limit their body. You program their mind. You control what they're allowed to love, who they're allowed to trust, what they're allowed to believe. And over generations, something terrifying happens. They stop needing cages, because the control is already inside. Imagine a girl born into a New England family that traces its roots back to the Salem witch trials. Her mother is also her aunt. Her father a second cousin 3 times over. She's taught from birth that their lineage is chosen, that they carry purity, and outsiders carry weakness. Now imagine what happens when she's taught never to question that. She becomes the perfect vessel, for silence, for obedience, for continuation. In the early 1900s, records surface of boarding schools where girls from good families were sent not to learn, but to be conditioned. Trained in etiquette, yes, but also isolation, disassociation, submission to hierarchy. Taught that blood was everything, and contamination, worse than death. These weren't rural schools, These were elite institutions, ivy-wrapped buildings still standing today, some with billion-dollar endowments. Some of these women married into politics, some into finance, some became symbols of American womanhood, beauty queens, actresses, first ladies. But behind the curtains, genetic fragility, paranoia, secret treatments, private doctors on permanent retainer. You were shown the polished image. You were never told what it cost. A woman born from multiple generations of inbreeding might appear poised, but inside, her neurology could be fragmented. She might struggle with hallucinations, seizures, emotional extremes. Yet in high society, these symptoms were dismissed as hysteria and quietly contained. Sedated, discredited, forgotten. The cycle continued. Because the belief system was never about health. It was about preservation. Preserving not just wealth or land, but blood identity. And that idea, twisted, elitist, deeply embedded, never died. It simply went underground. And now, it's coming back. They wear suits now. They speak at conferences, fund universities, smile for cameras, but their ideology hasn't changed. Because behind the mask of modernity, the same ancient obsession with blood purity still thrives. Only now it's rebranded, wrapped in the language of legacy, tradition, genetics, and heritage preservation. Let me show you how it works. Start with legacy admissions. You think they're just about rewarding alumni families? No. They're a tool, a legal mechanism to ensure that only certain bloodlines gain access to elite knowledge pipelines. Ivy League schools, private boarding academies, and secretive societies like Skull and Bones. They don't just admit the talented, they admit the predetermined. Look into the families behind them, names that echo through halls of power, media, and finance. You'll find marriages that trace back centuries, interlinked trees, cousins marrying cousins, generation after generation, with just enough outside genes to keep the public calm, but never enough to disrupt the inner circle. Now pair that with the modern obsession over genetic testing. Ever wondered why billionaires are pouring money into private genome research? It's not just about curing disease, it's about cataloging blood, mapping purity, isolating elite traits. Some of the same families that practiced selective inbreeding 100 years ago are now using biotech to do the same thing, but with labs instead of bedrooms. Same control, new technology. Meanwhile, women born into these legacies are still conditioned from childhood to marry within suitable families, not by force, but by design. Groomed through elite prep schools, debutante circuits, curated friendships. If a daughter steps outside the circle, chooses love over blood, she's not punished. She's erased. Their wedding isn't attended, their names scrubbed from the family tree, quiet calls mad. It cut connections. And if that child ever has a daughter of her own, she's watched closely. You see, this isn't about biology anymore. It's about control of identity. Who gets to belong, who's allowed to reproduce, and who becomes invisible. The women you never see, the ones whose photos vanished, whose lives ended in quiet clinics, whose stories were never told. They are the real foundation of this system. And it's not ancient history. It's ongoing. Every empire hides behind a scripture, and America, its sanctified bloodlines in the name of God. Let's go back to the early 1800s, when frontier churches were springing up faster than towns. Beneath the steeples and behind the hymnals, a darker sermon was being preached. Not in public, not from the pulpit, but in private homes, family Bibles, and coded doctrine passed from father to son. It said this: God chooses blood. and the chosen keep it pure. At first, it was just whispered. But soon, entire sects began to quietly embrace the idea that family lineage was a sign of divine favor. That generational purity, untainted by outsiders, was proof of spiritual superiority. A warped theology, one not based on faith, but on genetic exclusivity. In small religious communities, especially in isolated regions like rural Utah, Appalachia, parts of Missouri and Oregon, this belief took deep root, and it's still alive. Some of the most infamous cases of female inbreeding in U.S. history occurred inside these spiritual frameworks. Daughters married off to cousins under the guise of keeping the covenant. Teenage girls told that resistance was rebellion, not against the father, but against God himself. If you look into the case files from these communities, you'll find a disturbing pattern. Girls born with fused spines, no eyelids, clubbed hands, severe cognitive collapse by age 10, and still, it continued, because the bloodline mattered more than the body. But here's where it gets even more sinister. Many of these communities were funded, quietly, by men from outside. Wealthy benefactors with old names watching from afar. Why? Because they saw something in these isolated groups. A perfect test environment, closed systems, generational control, psychological obedience. If a doctrine could convince a mother to marry her daughter to her nephew in the name of salvation, then waited. Couldn't be justified. Today, some of those churches are mega campuses, others quiet compounds, all still flying flags of faith, while inside young women, genetically worn, emotionally fractured, are taught that their only worth is womb and obedience. You were told religion was about saving souls, but in these dark corners it was used to breed submission, and the bloodlines they protected, still tied, directly, to old American money. In a moment, we'll follow the trail from chapel to capitol. But first, comment the phrase, "I see through the veil," twice below. Let them know you've awakened, and that you won't look away. They walk the halls of Washington like relics wrapped in modern skin. Senators, judges, governors, their names carved into buildings, whispered through back rooms, passed from committee to commission. But look closer, and you'll see the same thing that ruled ancient thrones and rotted Appalachian cabins. Blood, protected, at all costs. You think America's leadership rotates through elections? That power changes hands every 4 years? That's the illusion. What actually changes is the mask. Trace the genealogy of 5 U.S. presidents, and you'll find shared ancestors, sometimes distant cousins, sometimes disturbingly close. Go deeper, and you'll find those same roots tied to colonial plantations, elite East Coast families, and yes, known inbreeding cases hidden beneath false birth certificates. In the 1930s, several political dynasties quietly underwent bloodline reviews, not for health, for purity, for legacy potential. They wanted to know which daughters could marry which sons without threatening the internal web of wealth and loyalty. These weren't poor mountain towns. They were Harvard alumni, senators' daughters, Supreme Court clerks. Women born into duty, not freedom. There's even record of political wives who, after bearing genetically imperfect children, were quietly removed. Not divorced, disappeared, replaced in public, erased in private. Their medical records sealed, their graves unmarked. And behind it all, a network of silent men with ancient last names and modern portfolios. These aren't conspiracies. They're documented, just not publicized. Because here's the rule. You can mock the puppet, but you must never name the puppeteer. What if I told you that some of the most powerful lobbying groups in America are family-run, not corporate families, Blood families. What if I told you that those American values they preach are just sanitized verse, scions of the same purity cult logic that destroyed countless women behind closed doors? Controlled breeding, restricted access, ruthless eugenics masked as policy. One senator, decades ago, was caught on tape saying, "We don't marry for love, we marry for strategy, just like the old houses of Europe." He was re-elected. Twice. So now ask yourself, how much of what you see, what you vote for, is actually chosen by you? And how much has already been decided, generations ago? Hospitals were never built to save everyone. That's a myth, a bedtime story for the masses. The real history of American medicine is soaked in segregation, experimentation, and quiet extermination. And at its core was the unspoken mission: preserve the chosen, remove the rest. Let's start with the early 20th century, when hospitals weren't public institutions, but gated systems for the elite. While poor women gave birth on kitchen floors, the daughters of America's ruling families delivered behind marble walls, under the care of private doctors sworn to silence. These doctors knew the truth. Inbreeding had consequences: bone deformities, missing organs, neurological collapse. But they also knew something else. These girls couldn't be allowed to die publicly, because exposure would mean scandal, and scandal meant cracks in the dynasty. So they created solutions: quiet wings, private psych wards, and in some cases, termination protocols. Deformed infants were labeled stillborn without examination. Defective pregnancies quietly lost in the third trimester. Some daughters never left the hospital, not because they died, but because they were never allowed back out. They became shadows, case numbers, confidential patients, and the same hospitals that erased them were rewarded. Massive endowments from the families they protected, wing after wing built in honor of men who built nothing, just wrote checks to keep their names clean and their daughters buried. Fast forward. Today, genetic counseling is sold as a tool for family health. But who funds those labs? Who designs the risk metrics? Who decides which markers mean defective? Once again, the power lies not with the patient, but with the gatekeepers of blood. There are stories, never officially recorded, of women flagged by genetic screens, then gently pushed toward sterilization. For your peace of mind, they retold, just in case. But if you trace the funding trail, you'll see a pattern. Elite families don't just use medicine, they own it. From the Rockefeller medical schools to pharma dynasties and bioethics boards, the same names appear over and over, the same names that show up in century-old family trees, riddled with genetic entanglements. Their mission: control evolution from the top, to weed out the weak, to secure the throne, and to keep the bloodline intact, no matter the cost to the women inside it. There are places you've never heard of. Rooms buried deep beneath the earth, clinical, cold, silent, but humming with power. Not prisons, not hospitals, nurseries. You won't find them on hospital blueprints. They aren't advertised in glossy medical brochures, but they exist, under federal buildings, in private compounds, and beneath research universities, whose real projects are sealed by national security orders. Inside, women, but not just any women. Surrogates, heirs, bloodline vessels. They are not chosen for health, or brilliance, or beauty. They are chosen for genetic compatibility, with bloodlines going back centuries. Selected from obscure European villages, ancient American families, or closed religious communities that still enforce blood purity through inbreeding. They don't meet the father, they don't sign contracts, most don't even know what they're carrying. Some are told they're part of a fertility study. Others are paid to participate in a legacy program. What they're really doing is giving birth to engineered heirs, children with DNA mapped, filtered, enhanced by CRISPR and privately held genomic tools. The goal isn't health, the goal is preservation. To recreate the original stock, to rebuild the ideal genetic architecture of a family once powerful, now biologically crumbling from centuries of incest. And if the pregnancy fails, she is dismissed. Memory wiped through sedation and a fabricated health crisis. If the child survives, but is imperfect, it's labeled unsuccessful, quietly adopted out through private agencies that specialize in high-security placements. But if the child meets the mark, perfect symmetry, IQ above threshold, no known markers, that child disappears. Raised not by a mother, but by handlers, tutors, advisors, every word scripted, every environment controlled, trained from birth to speak a certain way, eat a certain way, marry a certain way, and when the time comes, they are inserted into the world, a politician, a CEO, a tech visionary, but always, always, a carrier of the original blood. You've seen them. Young, charismatic, untouchable, no known parents, just rising stars placed in your media feed like divine accidents. But they're not accidents, they're artifacts, birthed in silence, groomed in shadows, deployed for dominance. And the women who carried them, vanished, forgotten, some buried under names that were never real to begin with. They wear suits now, smile for press releases, hold summits about global wellness, sustainable futures, and genomic ethics. But peel back their polished language, and you'll find a rotting skeleton, one that began in the American eugenics movement and never really ended. Most people think eugenics died with the Nazis. They're wrong. After World War II, the word eugenics was buried, but its blueprints were absorbed, rebranded, given new life in the United States under organizations with names like the Population Council, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, and countless bioethics boards funded by billionaires with ancient names and modern tech empires. Their mission didn't change, only the language did. Where they once spoke of purifying the race, they now speak of genetic optimization. Where they once called people defectives, they now reference risk factors. The same ideologies, the same blood logic, disguised as science, hidden behind philanthropic smiles. And yes, these councils still meet. In Aspen, in Davos, on private islands with biometric gates. No reporters, no transcripts, just agendas. They decide which diseases get funding, which genes are marked for editing, which populations are growing too fast and need intervention. They do it through policy, through influence, through pharmaceutical monopolies and global healthcare pipelines. They call it public health. But in reality, it's genetic filtration. One former insider leaked this phrase: the future must be curated. Curation, like museum pieces, except they're talking about humans. This is why certain rare disorders, often tied to incestuous bloodlines, never receive real attention. Because if the public understood where those disorders came from, they'd start asking about the families behind them. The ones still in power, still marrying cousins in private, till engineering the next heir behind closed doors. And if you think this is ancient history, ask yourself this: why did so many American elites quietly invest in gene editing startups just before the pandemic? Why are billionaires buying biotech patents like land? Why is CRISPR being tested in ways the public will never read about? Because the goal was never health. It was control of evolution, to become not just rulers, but gods. And the women, stillbred, still discarded, still hidden beneath a civilization built on bones. You've walked past them your whole life. Obelisks, domes, black and white marble floors with spirals, statues holding scales, birds with wings spread wide. You thought it was just architecture, just design. But these weren't aesthetic choices. They were ritual codexes. The elites don't just guard their bloodlines with science, they anchor them with ancient symbols, passed down from Sumer, Babylon, and Rome, and hidden in plain sight across America. Why? Because blood alone isn't enough to hold power. You need ritual. You need binding. You need submission of the will. Generational, spiritual submission. Look at Washington, D.C. Its entire layout was mapped by Freemasons, many of whom belonged to elite bloodlines. Every compass point, every building placement, every monument aligned to planetary gates and ancient temples. The Capitol Dome. It mirrors the Roman Pantheon, once a temple of gods. The Washington Monument. A massive obelisk, the ancient Egyptian symbol of resurrection and masculine power, used in fertility rites for rulers to ensure the continuation of divine blood. But let's go deeper. Inside some of these buildings, sealed from public access, are chambers used for rituals. Not wild, cinematic sacrifices. No. Something colder. More elite. Bloodline affirmations. Imagine this. A young woman, barely 18, from a known family, is brought into a chamber under a courthouse. She stands beneath a dome. Around her, old men in robes. Not priests, but lawyers, judges, politicians. She repeats an oath, not of justice, but of blood loyalty. Her DNA has already been mapped, her partner already chosen. She will carry a child, and that child will carry the blood forward. These ceremonies are never filmed. But if you look closely at the family photographs of certain lineages, you'll see the same black-robed elder, present again and again, a keeper of the rites. These are ant religions, their blood cults disguised as public service, and the symbols? They're markers, not for you, but for them, like graffiti in an underworld language. Messages passed between buildings and books and bodies. Have you ever wondered why the same eagle that appears on the dollar bill, clutching arrows and an olive branch, also appears in elite family crests across Europe? It's not coincidence. It's inheritance. The American Empire wasn't born from democracy. It was born from ancient blood magic, layered into stone, oath, and birth. And if you're still watching, comment this twice now. Blood remembers, blood returns. Because those who remember can never be controlled again. There's a pattern they don't want you to notice. Every few decades, a woman breaks the chain. A daughter of one of the bloodlines. She runs, refuses the arranged union, exposes the rituals, reveals the sickness, and almost without fail, she vanishes. Publicly, the story is always the same. She had a breakdown. She entered a private clinic. She chose a quiet life. Sometimes she's declared dead under vague circumstances. Sometimes she reappears decades later, medicated, silenced, and deeply spiritual, but never the same. But the truth? She was punished. Not just physically, but spiritually. You see, for these families, blood is more than lineage. It's a living contract. And when one of their own tries to tear it apart, the others don't just disown her. They perform a ritual reversal, an inversion of the blood oath. The process is ancient. Some call it the black sealing. Others refer to it as the silence. Here's how it works. The woman is brought before her elders, not in court, not in church, but in a sealed stone room, usually beneath a private estate. She is told, "You have shamed the line." Then the blood book is opened, a genealogical record going back centuries. Her name is blotted out, her image burned, a piece of her hair cast into oil and fire. To the world, it's just another rebellious heiress who disappeared. But within the circles of the elite, she is marked, cursed. Any child she bears outside the bloodline will be tracked, marked as unfit, denied opportunity, and the woman, watched for life. Her phones tapped, her friends infiltrated, her lovers manipulated. Why such extreme measures? Because when a woman of the blood breaks away, she becomes a mirror. She reflects everything the family wants hidden, the deformities, the mental collapses, the false purity, the control, and if her story gets out, if she speaks to the wrong person, the illusion shatters. But here's the darkest truth. Some don't break away on their own. Some are sacrificed to look like rebels, used as scapegoats, distractions, or political martyrs, their fall choreographed to draw attention away from the real corruption. You've seen them. High-profile suicides, mental health breakdowns caught on camera, mystery disappearances of celebrity daughters. The media blames pressure, addiction, troubled pasts. But what if the real cause was a bloodline curse, activated by disobedience? You've heard the name, even if you don't know the weight of it. The Merovingians, said to descend from a union between a Frankish king and something not entirely human. For centuries, their bloodline was whispered about in secret societies, hunted by rival houses, and protected by cult-like orders embedded in the church, the crown, and later, the founding fabric of America itself. But this isn't just a European legend. The Merovingian line, that ancient current of royal blood, didn't vanish. It was transferred. When the American colonies rebelled, it wasn't just about taxation. It was about freedom from the Vatican's shadow and escape from British blood politics. But the founders didn't reject bloodlines entirely. They absorbed them. George Washington himself was initiated into secret orders tied to Merovingian lore. Thomas Jefferson studied genealogies obsessively, with blood charts found among his private writings. And Benjamin Franklin? He had ties to European secret societies who believed divine right wasn't dead. It just needed rebranding. When America was formed, it didn't abandon royal blood. It cloaked it under democracy. What followed was a hidden import of Merovingian heirs, families with names you wouldn't recognize unless you traced them backward through false marriages, sealed records, and sudden rises to power. Names like Astor, DuPont, Harriman, old money, yes, but also old blood. And here's the terrifying part. Every American president who strayed too far from the bloodline's wishes faced accidents, scandals, or bullets. Lincoln, Kennedy, even Reagan. All of them challenged the central banks. All of them moved against the true elite, the ones who don't appear on Forbes lists because they own the institutions that publish those lists. And today, that same bloodline is quietly embedded in Silicon Valley, in biotech, in black budget space programs. They no longer wear crowns, they wear hoodies, lab coats, and algorithm badges, but their rituals haven't changed. Still celebrating the same solstices, still marking their children with ancient oil during the third week of May, still preserving the Merovingian seed, now crossbred with AI, to engineer the next phase of human dominance. They don't believe in equality, they believe in divine order. And to them, you're either useful or disposable. There's a phrase whispered in elite biotech circles: organic sovereignty ends at the machine. What does it mean? It means your blood, your heritage, your genetic identity no longer belongs to nature. It belongs to the system, to algorithms, to databases where your genome is just a string of code waiting to be edited, bought, or erased. We have entered the age of AI-driven eugenics. Not with white lab coats and syringes in open view, but through subtle, quiet integration. Direct-to-consumer DNA tests, ancestry apps, wearable tech monitoring your biology, CRISPR trials hidden in cancer treatments, fertility clinics offering screening for superior outcomes. Behind the convenience is a darker truth. Your data is being fed into learning machines. Machines that are training on millions of bloodlines, not just to cure disease, but to map which traits should survive. What does that sound like to you? It sounds like digital natural selection, but curated by men. Men with power. Men with bloodline agendas. The AI doesn't decide what's desirable. They do. They train it. They set the parameters. They choose which traits to highlight and which to flag as defective. And who are they? The same ancient families we've been tracing. Except now, they're no longer just managing estates and controlling banks. They're building the next phase of humanity, coded with preference for their own blood. Imagine this. A child is born in 2035. Their DNA pre-screened, CRISPR-enhanced, and logged in a secure blockchain. Their behavioral traits predicted by algorithm. Their social value pre-ranked. Their mating potential matched by ancestry-driven AIs. And if they don't match the right genetic profile, no elite school, no access to certain technologies, no approval for reproductive pairings. This is not sci-fi. This is already happening in embryo labs in California, Singapore, and Israel, privately funded by billionaires, quietly tested on volunteer populations. Results sealed under proprietary bioethics loopholes. The inbred women we discussed earlier. They were prototypes. Proof that traits, no matter how disturbing, can be preserved and manipulated through generational control. But now the process doesn't need arranged marriages, it needs code. And once the AI learns enough, it won't just guide who gets born, it will decide who is allowed to exist. One more section remains. Beneath all the symbols, the rituals, the bloodlines, and the machines, there is a covenant, not written in any constitution, not stored in any library, but embedded in the very foundation of America, like a dark pact carved into stone before the first colony was born. Let me take you back, before the Revolution, before Plymouth, to 1607, Jamestown, Virginia. The first permanent English settlement wasn't just a foothold for empire, it was a ritual site, carefully chosen by occult geographers, founded under the authority of King James, a man obsessed with demonology, scripture codes, and bloodline purity. He authorized a new kind of colony, not just a land grab, but a spiritual experiment. The goal? To birth a new Atlantis, a purified society. Ruled not by visible kings, but by hidden architects. Men who believed they were restoring the lost age of divine rulership, before the flood, before Babel, when gods and men walked as one. And so, the covenant was made. If America preserved the sacred blood, and veiled it behind the illusion of freedom, then power, real, metaphysical power, would endure. That's why Washington, D.C. was laid out in sacred geometry. That's why every major federal building aligns with equinox points and stellar nodes. That's why the dollar bill bears Masonic iconography, and why presidents swear on Bibles they never read. This isn't patriotism, it's prophecy management. Because those who rule understand something most people never will. Belief shapes reality. And belief, when coded into ritual and reinforced by generations of breeding, can bend fate itself. But here's the secret they fear most. You can opt out. You don't have to carry the blind code. You don't have to live by the myths they injected into your family. You don't have to submit to the narrative that you were born without power, because power is reclaimed through awareness. And awareness begins with naming the machine. So if you've made it this far, if you've stared into the abyss and refused to blink, you are no longer who you were when you pressed play. You have crossed the threshold. Now speak it, twice, out loud or in the comments. Blood remembers. Blood returns. Let them feel the echo. Because the only force stronger than a bloodline is a man who chooses his own. And now you know what was never meant to be known. The question is, what will you do with it?